Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Chris Williams, and I've been a forest ranger for exactly 13 months when Hannah Murphy disappeared into the Hila wilderness. But what I'm about to tell you happened in October 2008, when time itself became my enemy, and a creature from nightmares turned my first real case into a supernatural hell that nearly broke my mind. I was 24, fresh out of training, still carrying that rookie eagerness that made the veteran rangers roll their eyes when I volunteered for the tough assignments. Hannah Murphy was 19, a college student from Albuquerque who'd gone hiking alone despite her family's warnings. And when her iPhone stopped pinging cell towers on October 13th, I was the eager young ranger who insisted I could find her before the real search teams got organized. Kids probably just got turned around, Ranger Davis told me, adjusting his worn baseball cap. These college kids come up here with their fancy GPS units and think they can conquer the wilderness. But I'd seen the fear in Hannah's mother's eyes when she gripped my uniform shirt and whispered, "Please bring my baby home." And something about her desperate love made me promise I'd find her daughter no matter what. The first sign something was wrong came 3 miles up the Mogollon Trail, when I found Hannah's pink hiking backpack hanging from the exact same gnarled oak tree where I'd found her water bottle an hour earlier. I stood there staring, my heart pounding against my ribs because I distinctly remembered putting that water bottle in my evidence bag and radioing its location to base camp. My Motorola radio crackled with static when I tried to call it in, and my 2008 Garmin GPS unit kept spinning between coordinates like it couldn't decide where the hell I actually was. "Base camp, this is Williams," I said into the radio, but all I got back was white noise that sounded almost like screaming. I pressed forward, following what looked like Hannah's footprints in the soft earth. But 30 minutes later, I was standing in front of that same damn oak tree again, with her backpack swaying in the autumn breeze like some kind of twisted pendulum. The rational part of my brain insisted I'd gotten turned around, but the compass on my belt pointed steadily north, and I'd been walking in a straight line. That's when I heard the sound that would haunt my nightmares for years afterward. A wet, chittering noise like a cross between a bat and something much larger, something that had learned to mimic human speech. "Chris," it called from somewhere in the trees above me, using my own name and Hannah's voice. "Chris, help me, I'm lost." I spun in a circle, my flashlight beam dancing across the canopy, but saw nothing except shadows that seemed to move independently of the wind. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it echoing off the canyon walls, and when I checked my watch, the digital display read 3:47 p.m., the exact same time it had shown when I'd first found the backpack. "Hannah?" I called back, my voice cracking like a teenager's. "Hannah, if that's you, keep talking so I can find you." But the forest had gone completely silent, not even the rustle of leaves or the buzz of insects, just an oppressive quiet that made my eardrums ache. I started running then, crashing through the underbrush with my radio in one hand and my emergency flare gun in the other, desperate to break whatever invisible boundary was keeping me trapped in this nightmare loop. But no matter which direction I ran, north toward the ridge, south toward the creek, east toward the old mining road, I always ended up back at that oak tree with Hannah's backpack, and my watch always showed 3:47 p.m. By the fourth time I found myself at the tree, panic was clawing at my throat like a living thing, and I could taste copper in my mouth from biting my tongue. That's when I saw the scratches in the oak's bark, 4 parallel gashes that looked like claw marks, except they were too big for any bear or mountain lion, too deep for anything that should exist in these mountains. "She's not lost," a voice whispered behind me, and I spun around to see a shape that my brain refused to process correctly. It stood about 7 feet tall on powerful hind legs, with leathery gray skin that seemed to absorb light, and eyes that glowed like hot coals in a face that was almost human, but wrong in every fundamental way. "She's mine now, little ranger, just like time is mine, just like you are mine." I raised my flare gun with shaking hands, but the creature, the chupacabra, because what else could it be, just laughed with a sound like breaking glass. "You can't shoot what controls when you pull the trigger," it said. And suddenly I was back at the tree again, 3:47 p.m. on my watch, the flare gun still holstered at my belt. The loops started coming faster after that, sometimes lasting only minutes before I'd find myself back at the starting point, and with each reset I could feel pieces of my sanity cracking away like old paint. I tried marking the tree with my knife, but the cuts would vanish with each loop. I tried radioing for help, but my calls echoed back in my own voice, begging for rescue from previous loops. During one loop, I found Hannah sitting at the base of the oak tree, but when I approached her, she looked up with the chupacabra's glowing eyes. "Why didn't you save me, Chris?" she asked in her mother's voice. "Why weren't you fast enough?" In another loop, I discovered my own body hanging from the tree's branches, tongue swollen and black, while the creature wearing my face radioed false coordinates to the search teams. I was losing count of the resets. 50? 100? When something different happened. Instead of finding the backpack, I found a small photo that must have fallen from Hannah's things. Her hugging a middle-aged woman and man, all three of them grinning at the camera with the kind of pure joy that only comes from unconditional family love. On the back, someone had written in Hannah's handwriting, "Mom and Dad, thank you for teaching me that love is stronger than fear. Always your little girl." That's when the truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The creature wasn't just trapping me in time, it was feeding on my fear, my panic, my growing desperation. But Hannah's family's love, that photograph, that simple message, it was like a beacon cutting through the supernatural darkness. I closed my eyes and thought about Hannah's mother gripping my shirt, the fierce protective love in her voice when she'd begged me to bring her daughter home. I thought about every missing person case I'd trained for, every family counting on rangers like me to bring their loved ones back safely. The love wasn't just Hannah's family. It was the love that connected every person who refused to give up on someone they cared about. When I opened my eyes, I was still at the oak tree, but something fundamental had changed. The shadows seemed less oppressive, and my watch now read 3:48 p.m. Time was moving again. "No!" The chupacabra's voice shrieked from somewhere above me, and I could hear real fear in that inhuman sound. "You belong to the loop. You belong to me." But I was already moving, following not the false trails it had been showing me, but the pull I felt toward Hannah's family's love, like an invisible cord connecting me to their desperation. I found her in a cave system that hadn't existed in any of my previous loops. Unconscious but alive, with strange bite marks on her neck that looked partially healed. The chupacabra was crouched over her like some nightmare gargoyle, its leathery skin now looking pale and sickly. "She's been feeding me through her dreams," it hissed. But its voice was weaker now, less certain. "Fear tastes so much better when it's seasoned with hope. But you brought something else, something I can't digest." That's when I understood the creature's true nature. It wasn't just a monster that drank blood. It was a supernatural parasite that fed on the temporal energy created by fear and desperation, trapping victims in loops of terror to maximize the emotional harvest. But love, real unconditional family love, was like poison to it. I pulled out Hannah's photo and held it up like a shield. "This is what you can't touch," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "This is what you can never understand or control." The creature recoiled as if I'd brandished a cross at a vampire, its glowing eyes dimming. But the real twist came when Hannah opened her eyes and looked at me with perfect clarity. "Chris Williams," she said, and her voice carried an otherworldly resonance that made the cave walls tremble. "Thank you for breaking the loop. Now it's my turn to break something." She stood up, and I realized that during all those loops, while the chupacabra had been feeding on fear through her dreams, she'd been learning. She'd absorbed some of its temporal manipulation abilities, and now she could see through time the same way I'd learned to see through love. "It's been trapping people here for over a century," Hannah said, placing her hand on the cave wall. "All those missing hikers, all those unsolved disappearances, they're all here, Chris, trapped in loops, feeding it forever." Her eyes began to glow with the same light as the creature's, but instead of menace, there was purpose. But love breaks loops. Love breaks everything that tries to cage it. Together we shattered not just our own temporal prison, but dozens of others. As each loop collapsed, I glimpsed the faces of other victims. Hikers from the 1960s, prospectors from the 1800s, even what looked like ancient Native Americans, all trapped in their own cycles of fear, until Hannah's love-amplified power set them free. The chupacabra let out a sound like reality tearing as its food source disappeared, and in its death throes, I saw its true form. Not a monster, but a wounded creature that had been trapped in its own loop of hunger and loneliness for so long, it had forgotten what it meant to simply exist without consuming others. We emerged from that cave system on October 14, 2008, exactly 24 hours after Hannah had first gone missing. Though I felt like I'd aged a decade, the search teams found us just after dawn, and while the official report listed the case as a successful rescue with no mention of supernatural elements, Hannah's mother hugged us both and whispered, "I felt you fighting for her. I felt your love bringing her home." Hannah recovered completely, though she sometimes gets a distant look in her eyes and talks about seeing time streams that most people can't perceive. She's studying theoretical physics now, writing papers about temporal mechanics that make professors scratch their heads and wonder how an undergraduate student can have such intuitive understanding of concepts that shouldn't exist. As for me, I'm not a rookie ranger anymore. I've spent the last 17 years specializing in cases that other people write off as impossible, and I've learned that love really is the most powerful force in any reality, natural or supernatural. Every time I find someone who was given up for lost, every time I bring a family back together, I think about that photograph and remember that fear may trap us in loops, but love always finds a way to break the pattern. My name is Chris Williams, and I've learned that some monsters are just loneliness in disguise. Some prisons are made of time itself, and the strongest supernatural force in any universe is a family's refusal to stop loving someone, even when hope seems impossible. The Hila wilderness is quiet now, but sometimes on autumn nights when the moon is dark, you can still hear echoes of gratitude whispering through the trees, the voices of every soul we freed, saying thank you to the love that wouldn't let them go. My name is Chris Walker, and I've been a forest ranger for 18 goddamn years. Seen everything these woods can throw at you. Bears, mountain lions, flash floods that'll sweep you into hell and back. Lost hikers, drug labs, illegal hunters, you name it. Point is, I thought I knew every trail, every rock, every twisted tree in this godforsaken stretch of haunted forest they call Sleepy Hollow State Park. I was wrong about a lot of things that October, but I was dead fucking wrong about knowing these woods. The call came in at 3:17 p.m. on October 29, 2019. Maya Peterson, 16 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen hiking the Headless Hollow Trail with friends around noon. Her friends made it back. Maya didn't. Standard search and rescue, or so I thought, until I met her parents at the ranger station and saw something in their eyes I'd never seen before. Not just fear, but this bone-deep terror, like they knew something I didn't. "She's been having nightmares," her mother whispered, gripping her husband's hand so tight her knuckles went white. "About a man on a horse, a man with no head." She said he was calling to her. Her father just stared at the missing person poster we'd printed, Maya's smiling face looking back at us, and I swear to God his hands were shaking. I should have listened to them, should have paid attention to the way every local volunteer who showed up for the search kept glancing at the sky, checking their watches, muttering about getting out before dark. Instead, I did what I always did. Took charge, organized search grids, sent teams out with radios and GPS units that started acting weird the moment we hit the deep woods. The first time loop happened at 4:43 p.m., but I didn't realize it until the third time I found Maya's pink hair scrunchie caught on the same damn thorn bush beside Cranes Creek. Same position, same small tear in the fabric, same way it fluttered in a wind that shouldn't have been there in the dead calm of that October afternoon. My GPS showed I'd been walking southeast for 2 hours straight, but somehow I kept ending up at the exact same spot. "Base, this is Walker," I radioed, but got nothing back except static that sounded almost like whispers if you listened close enough. My iPhone had 2 bars but wouldn't connect to anything. No calls, no texts, no internet. The battery was draining faster than it should have, jumping from 78% to 34% in what felt like minutes. That's when I heard the hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, echoing through trees that had gone silent in a way that made your skin crawl. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the steady clip-clop getting closer, and I found myself thinking about every goddamn story I'd ever heard about these woods. Local legends about a headless rider who collected souls on Halloween night. Revolutionary War soldiers who never found their way home. Accidents and disappearances that happened way too often for coincidence. I followed the sound deeper into the forest, past markers I'd installed myself, past emergency supply caches I'd stocked just last month. The trees grew thicker, older, twisted into shapes that reminded you of gnarled hands reaching up from hell. And there, carved into the massive oak that locals called the hanging tree, were fresh letters. MP, Maya Peterson. But I'd never seen that carving before, and I'd walked past this tree 1,000 times in 18 years. The hoofbeats stopped. I turned around and Maya was standing there in her hiking clothes exactly as she'd looked in the missing person photo, except her eyes were wrong. Too wide, too knowing, like she'd seen things that had aged her soul about 50 years in the span of 6 hours. "Mr. Walker," she said, and her voice carried in the dead air like it was coming from underwater. "I've been waiting for you. He told me you'd come." I started toward her, but the world lurched sideways like reality had stumbled over its own feet. The forest blurred, colors bled together, and when everything snapped back into focus, I was standing at Crane's Creek again, looking at Maya's hair scrunchie on the exact same thorn bush. 4:43 p.m. on my watch. Again. This time I paid attention to everything. The way shadows fell, the position of clouds, the specific pattern of leaves on the ground. Started the loop over, followed the same path, heard the same hoofbeats, found the same carving that shouldn't have existed. But when Maya appeared, I was ready. "Who told you I'd come?" I demanded. She smiled, and it wasn't her smile anymore. Something else was wearing Maya Peterson's face, something that had never been human. "The horseman. He rides for her family, Mr. Walker. He always has." The world lurched again, but this time I fought it, grabbing onto that carved oak tree and holding on while reality tried to reset itself around me. The bark felt real under my hands, solid and rough and covered in 100 years of carved initials. Maya's was just the newest, but as I held on, I could see the others starting to fade, dissolving like they were written in water. That's when I understood. This wasn't just a time loop, and it was a prison. Something was keeping Maya trapped here, replaying the same few hours over and over, and now it had me too. The hoofbeats started again, but this time they were angry. Thunderous, like whatever was out there knew I was fighting back. Through the trees I caught glimpses of movement. A dark horse, massive and wrong, moving too fast and too quiet. And riding it. Jesus Christ, riding it was something that had been a man once. Still wore the remnants of what might have been a Revolutionary War uniform. Blue wool faded to gray, brass buttons tarnished black. But where his head should have been was just empty air. And he carried something in his left hand that made my stomach turn over. A jack-o'-lantern with Maya's face carved into it, glowing from the inside with sick yellow light. I ran. Fuck protocol. Fuck my 18 years of experience. Fuck everything except getting away from that thing. But the forest had other ideas. Paths I'd known since I was a kid led nowhere, or led back to the same places, or led to impossible destinations like cliff faces where there should have been meadows and swamps where the ground had been dry an hour before. My watch kept jumping. 4:43, 5:17, 4:43, 5:32, 4:43. Time was broken here, shattered into pieces that didn't fit together anymore. And every loop was getting shorter, more distorted. Started seeing flashes of other searches I'd led, other missing persons cases from my career, faces of people I'd failed to save staring at me from behind trees that shouldn't have existed. Then I saw Maya again. But this time she was younger, maybe 8 years old, crying and calling for her parents. "I want to go home," she kept saying. "Please, I just want to go home." Before I could reach her, the world reset again. 4:43 p.m., Now Maya was older, maybe in her 20s, wearing a wedding dress stained with mud and leaves. "You're too late," she whispered. "You're always too late, just like with the others." Reset. 4:43 p.m. Maya as an old woman, gray-haired and broken, sitting on a fallen log. "I've been waiting here for 70 years, Mr. Walker. 70 years of the same day over and over. Do you know what that does to a person?" The loops were getting shorter, more vicious, showing me things that hadn't happened yet but might, could, would, if I didn't break this cycle somehow. Maya aging and dying in these woods while her parents searched for her. Maya's children never being born because she never escaped. Maya's grandchildren, great-grandchildren, entire bloodline snuffed out because I was too goddamn experienced and confident and stupid to believe in things that couldn't be explained by a Forest Service manual. That's when I remembered what her mother had said. Maya had been dreaming about the headless rider before she disappeared. This thing had been calling to her, hunting her family specifically. But why? I stopped running and started thinking like a ranger instead of a scared animal, pulled out my notepad and started documenting everything I could remember. Loop times, variations, what stayed the same and what changed. The carving on the tree was always fresh, always MP, but sometimes there were other initials around it. Historical records I'd read mentioned disappearances in these woods going back to the 1700s, always around Halloween, always young people with the initials MP. Mary Patterson, 1783, Michael Porter, 1834, Margaret Phillips, 1897. The thing wasn't just hunting Maya Peterson, it was hunting the Peterson family line, had been for over 200 years, and somehow, Maya was the last one. The hoofbeats started again, but this time, I didn't run. This time I stood my ground at the carved oak and waited. When the horseman appeared through the trees riding that impossible horse with Maya's carved pumpkin face glowing in his grip, I finally understood what I was looking at. The uniform wasn't Revolutionary War. It was Continental Army. This had been a soldier once, maybe even a local boy who died fighting for American independence. But something had gone wrong. Something had trapped him here, bound him to this place and this terrible purpose. The pumpkin head he carried wasn't just Maya's face. It was every MP he'd taken, every Peterson family member he'd collected over the centuries, all of them trapped inside that sick yellow glow. "You want her?" I shouted at the thing as it thundered toward me. "You want Maya Peterson? Then you'll have to go through me first." The horseman pulled up his mount maybe 10 feet away, and I could feel the cold radiating off him like winter had come early and brought hell with it. The pumpkin head turned toward me, Maya's carved features twisting into an expression of pure terror, and when it spoke, it was with her voice. "Run, Mr. Walker. Please run. Don't let him add you to his collection." But I didn't run. Instead, I did something that felt crazy but somehow right. I pulled out my phone and started recording. The screen was cracked, the battery almost dead, but the camera was working. Whatever technology glitch was affecting everything else. Maybe this would get through, maybe someone would find this footage and understand what happened here. "My name is Chris Walker," I said to the camera, keeping my eyes on the horseman. "If you're watching this, then Maya Peterson is trapped in some kind of supernatural prison in these woods, and there's something here that's been hunting her family for centuries. I don't know if I can save her, but I'm going to try." The horseman laughed, and it was the sound of wind through empty skull sockets, of leaves rustling in graveyards at midnight. He raised the pumpkin head high, and I could see other faces inside the yellow glow, generations of Petersons, all of them screaming silently. "You cannot break what has been bound by blood and betrayal," the thing said in a voice like grinding bones. "The Peterson line ends with her as it was always meant to. She is mine by right of conquest, by right of revenge." "Whose conquest?" I demanded. "What revenge?" The pumpkin head flickered, and suddenly I was seeing flashes of memory that weren't mine. A young Continental soldier named Jacob Crane, shot in the head by a British loyalist named William Peterson during a skirmish near these very woods. But Peterson had been wearing an American uniform, had been trusted, had killed Crane from behind while he was trying to help wounded patriots. "Betrayer," the horseman hissed. "Traitor. His blood debt passes to his children, and their children, and their children's children. Payment comes due every generation. That's not how justice works, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Maya never betrayed anyone. She's just a kid. She is Peterson blood. That is enough. The world started to loop again, but this time I fought it harder, digging my fingers into the bark of that carved oak and holding on like my life depended on it. The tree shuddered. Time fractured around us, and for just a moment I saw through the supernatural bullshit to what was really here. Maya Peterson, the real Maya, trapped inside some kind of spiritual cage that looked like a giant thorny cocoon hanging from the tree's highest branches. She was alive, unconscious but alive. "Maya!" I shouted up at her. "Maya, if you can hear me, your parents are looking for you. They love you, they're not giving up." The horseman roared and spurred his horse forward, raising what I now realized wasn't a pumpkin at all, but some kind of spiritual construct, all the stolen Peterson souls bound together into a weapon. But as he charged, something else happened. My radio crackled to life. Chris, do you copy? This is Janet Peterson, Maya's mom. We're not leaving these woods without our daughter. Do you hear me? We're not leaving." The voice was faint, distorted but real. Somehow Maya's parents were out there searching, had been searching all along, and their love was strong enough to punch through whatever supernatural interference was jamming communications. "I'm here," I shouted into the radio. "I found her. She's trapped in the big oak by Crane's Creek." "We're coming, baby." Maya's father's voice joined his wife's. "Maya, Daddy's coming. Hold on." The horseman's charge faltered. The bound souls in his spiritual weapon began to waver, flicker, their carved faces showing hope for the first time. And high above us, Maya's cocoon started to crack. That's when I understood the real trap. The horseman fed on despair, on isolation, on the belief that no one was coming to save you. But Maya's parents hadn't given up. After 6 hours of searching impossible woods, dealing with malfunctioning equipment and unexplained phenomena, they were still out there calling her name. Love was breaking the loop. "You lose," I told the horseman, pulling out my service weapon for the first time in 8 years. I'd never shot anything supernatural before, but maybe I didn't need to. Maybe I just needed to buy time for love to do what bullets couldn't. The horseman raised his weapon, the collected Peterson souls screaming in harmonized agony. But before he could strike, Maya's cocoon burst open like a flower blooming in fast motion. She fell maybe 30 feet and I caught her, both of us hitting the ground hard enough to see stars. "Dad?" she mumbled against my shoulder. "Mom?" "Right here, sweetheart." Janet Peterson's voice was getting stronger, closer. "We're right here." The horseman's form began to waver, his horse rearing and screaming like a thing in pain. The spiritual weapon dissolved, and suddenly the air was full of glowing figures. Every Peterson who'd been taken over the centuries, finally free to move on. They surrounded the horseman, not attacking but speaking in voices like wind through autumn leaves. "It's over, Jacob," Mary Patterson from 1783 said gently. "The war is over. William Peterson paid for his betrayal with his life 200 years ago. Their children aren't responsible for his sins. Let go," Michael Porter from 1834 added. "Let go of the anger. Let go of the revenge. Find peace." The horseman looked at them, then at Maya safe in my arms, then at the approaching flashlight beams of her parents crashing through the underbrush like love-powered tanks. For a moment, his headless form solidified into something almost human. I was so angry for so long," he said, and his voice was different now, younger, confused. "I couldn't remember why I was fighting anymore." "Now you can rest," Margaret Phillips from 1897 whispered. "Now you can go home." The horseman nodded once, raised his hand in what might have been a salute, and dissolved into golden light that scattered through the trees like fireflies. The other Peterson spirits lingered just long enough to smile at Maya, then followed him into whatever comes after, finally free. Maya's parents burst through the tree line 30 seconds later, and the reunion was everything you'd hope for. Tears, laughter, bone-crushing hugs, and about 50 apologies for not believing in family nightmares about headless horsemen. Maya was shaken, but unharmed, with no memory of the supernatural prison, just a vague recollection of getting turned around on the trail and falling asleep under a tree. My watch read 6:15 p.m., October 29th, 2019. Time was moving forward again. We all walked out together, Maya between her parents, me bringing up the rear and trying to process what had just happened. My phone had somehow recorded everything. The loops, the horseman, the spiritual weapon, all of it. But when I played it back at the ranger station, all I got was 6 hours of static and the sound of my own voice talking to empty air. Maya's parents invited me to dinner the next week, and I went. Good people. The kind who send thank you cards and remember your birthday. Maya seemed completely normal, talking about school and friends and her plans for college. The only sign anything had happened was a small scar on her palm that looked like the letter P. But that could have been from anything, right? I never told anyone the whole truth about what happened in those woods. Put it in my report as a standard lost hiker case, equipment malfunction due to unusual electromagnetic activity, successful rescue after 6 hours of searching, but I kept that footage, even if no one else can see what's really on it. Sometimes I go back to that oak tree, the one locals call the hanging tree. Maya's initials are gone now, carved over by time and weather. But if you know where to look, you can still see some of the older ones, faded but permanent. Mary Patterson, Michael Porter, Margaret Phillips, all the MPs who came before. Finally at rest. The Headless Hollow Trail got renamed the Peterson Family Trail last spring in honor of Maya's miraculous rescue and her family's unwavering determination. Maya graduated high school with honors and got accepted to veterinary school. Her parents still send me Christmas cards. And every October 29th I work a double shift in those woods just in case. Because love broke a 200-year curse that night. But love's a powerful thing, and powerful things leave echoes. I've never seen the horseman again, never gotten trapped in another time loop, never found another Peterson family member lost in supernatural prison. But I've learned something about these woods that 18 years of experience couldn't teach me. There are things out here older than our understanding, stranger than our science, and more dangerous than our training. Things that feed on isolation and despair, and the terrible certainty that no one is coming to save you. The only defense against them is what saved Maya Peterson and freed Jacob Crane and broke a curse that had lasted centuries. The stubborn, relentless, absolutely fucking unbreakable conviction that someone out there loves you enough to never give up the search. My name is Chris Walker, and I've been a forest ranger for 19 goddamn years now. I thought I knew these woods, but the woods taught me something better. Love is stronger than time. Love is stronger than death. And love is definitely stronger than whatever supernatural bullshit thinks it can separate families in my forest. I've got my radio, my GPS, my service weapon, and the absolute certainty that someone out there is worth fighting for. That's all the equipment a ranger really needs, even when the hoofbeats start again. My name is Tyler Bradford, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for 23 years. I've seen bodies torn apart by bears, found hikers who'd been dead for weeks, pulled survivors from avalanches that should have killed everyone. Hell, I've stared down mountain lions with nothing but a flashlight and my own stubborn refusal to back down. I earned my reputation the hard way, through 2 decades of bringing people home when everyone else had given up hope. But I've got secrets too. Dark ones that wake me up at 3 in the morning sweating through sheets I've changed twice that week. See, I'd been tracking patterns in disappearances since 2000, keeping my own files separate from the official reports. 15 years of cases where healthy young people vanished near specific trail markers, only to be found days later with wounds too precise for any animal. The FBI would show up, ask their questions, then everything would get classified under natural causes or animal attack. I knew better. I'd grown up in these woods, learned tracking from my grandfather who'd been a ranger here before World War II. He used to tell stories about the old hungry ones that lived in the deepest parts of the forest, things that had been feeding on human flesh since before the first European settlers arrived. I thought they were just campfire tales until I started finding bodies with surgical incisions and missing organs. By 2015, I had files on 37 cases spanning 15 years. All young, healthy victims, all found in remote locations with organs harvested by someone with medical training. All officially classified as wildlife attacks despite evidence that would make a first-year medical student laugh. The conspiracy went deep. Hospital administrators, county officials, even some of my fellow rangers seemed to know more than they were willing to say. But what happened in October 2015 when Isabella Garcia vanished? That shit changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in these woods and what they were willing to do to keep feeding. Isabella Garcia was 19, a University of Washington student who'd gone camping with 3 friends near the Hoh River Trail. I'd met kids like her before, pre-med honor student, the kind who color-coded her study schedules and carried emergency whistles even on day hikes. Her friends told me she'd been researching organ donation protocols for a bioethics paper, spending weeks interviewing transplant surgeons and studying surgical techniques. Smart kid, the kind who followed safety protocols and never strayed from marked paths. When her friends woke up on October 13th, Isabella's sleeping bag was empty, boots still lined up neatly by the tent zipper, like she'd just evaporated into the Pacific Northwest mist. But that's where the normal details ended. Her friend Jessica Martinez showed me Isabella's laptop, still logged into medical journals about organ harvesting and black market transplants. She'd been having nightmares for weeks, Jessica whispered. Kept saying she felt like someone was watching her, studying her. We thought it was just stress from her pre-med courses. The blood trail they found leading toward an unmarked path wasn't random droplets. It formed a pattern, almost like surgical markers indicating incision points. The scratches on nearby trees weren't from animal claws. They were precise, measured, like someone had been practicing surgical techniques on the bark. When I saw those marks, my blood went cold. I'd seen identical scratches at 17 different crime scenes over the past 15 years. The Garcia family met me at the ranger station that first morning, and I could see their whole world collapsing in real time. Isabella's mother, Maria, clutched a photo of her daughter in graduation cap and gown with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the phone call. She wanted to be a surgeon, Maria whispered, her voice breaking. She wanted to save people, help them live longer lives. She was going to specialize in organ transplants. The irony of it made me sick to my stomach. Roberto Garcia, Isabella's father, grabbed my arm with the desperate strength of a man watching his world collapse for the second time in 3 years. They'd already buried one child. Their oldest son, Miguel, had died in Afghanistan in 2013, stepping on an IED while trying to help wounded civilians. Isabella is all we have left, Roberto said, his voice barely controlled. She's our light, our hope, our reason to keep going. Please, Ranger Bradford, we've heard the stories about you. People say you find people when others give up. Please don't give up on our little girl. Their younger son, Carlos, only 16, stood silent in the corner, but I could see the rage building in his eyes. This is fucked up, he finally exploded. First Miguel, now Isabella. What kind of world takes away good people and leaves the monsters alone? His mother tried to shush him, but Roberto just pulled the boy closer. He's right to be angry, the father said. We're all angry, but anger won't bring Isabella home, only you can do that. I'd handled hundreds of missing persons cases, but something about Isabella's disappearance felt wrong from the start, and not just because of the surgical precision of the evidence. This felt personal, targeted, like someone had been watching Isabella Garcia specifically. When I looked at her pre-med transcripts, I saw she'd scored in the 99th percentile on anatomy exams, had been selected for advanced surgical workshops, and had been volunteering at the trauma center for 2 years. Someone with medical knowledge would know exactly how valuable her organs would be on the black market. The pieces were connecting in ways that made me want to throw up, but I couldn't let the family see my fear. I'd failed too many families before by letting my suspicions paralyze me instead of driving me to action. Not this time. Not with Isabella Garcia. The Garcia family met me at the ranger station that first morning, Isabella's mother clutching a photo of her daughter in graduation cap and gown. She wanted to be a surgeon, Maria Garcia whispered, her hands shaking. She wanted to save people, help them. Please, Ranger Bradford, she's everything to us, she's our light. The father, Roberto, grabbed my arm with the desperate strength of a man watching his world collapse. We know you found people when others couldn't. We've heard the stories. Please. I started the search that afternoon with my usual confidence. 23 years in these mountains had taught me that missing people left traces, broken branches, footprints, scraps of fabric caught on thorns. The Olympic Peninsula might seem vast and wild, but it followed patterns, and I knew every goddamn one of them. What I didn't expect was for the forest itself to start playing games with my mind. The first sign something was wrong came around mile marker 3 on the Ho River Trail. I'd been following Isabella's trail for 6 hours, using tracking skills my grandfather had taught me when I was barely old enough to hold a compass. The physical evidence was consistent. Broken branches at shoulder height, size 7 boot prints in soft earth, threads from her UC Berkeley sweatshirt caught on thorns. Standard search and rescue, the kind of case I could work in my sleep. Then I found the sweatshirt. It was hanging from a branch exactly where it shouldn't be. The same Douglas fir I'd examined 3 times in the past hour, photographed from every angle, marked with GPS coordinates. I'd have sworn on my grandfather's grave the tree had been empty when I'd passed it before. But there it was, Isabella's sweatshirt, hanging like a flag of surrender, and when I reached for it, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. That's when I heard the whisper. Too late again, Bradford. I spun around, hand moving instinctively to my service weapon, scanning the forest with eyes that had tracked everything from wounded elk to escaped convicts. The woods were empty, just the sound of my own breathing getting faster and the October wind through the evergreens. But I knew that voice even after 15 years. It belonged to someone who should have been dead and buried. Sarah Chen materialized between 2 Douglas firs about 30 yards away, wearing the same surgical scrubs she'd died in. I remembered every detail of her case. 22 years old, nursing student at UW, found by Crescent Lake in September 2000 with her kidneys missing and surgical wounds so precise they could have been from a medical textbook. The official cause of death was animal attack with post-mortem tissue damage, but every cop who saw the body knew better. You remember me now, don't you? Sarah said, her voice carrying across the forest like wind through dead leaves. Sarah Chen, going to be a trauma nurse, going to save lives in the emergency room. Instead, I became another statistic, another wildlife attack that you let slide into your cold case files. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. Sarah Chen had been my 3rd case, back when I was still naive enough to believe the official explanations. I'd found inconsistencies in her autopsy report, surgical instruments used, professional-grade anesthesia in her bloodstream, precise suture patterns that no animal could create. When I'd brought my concerns to the FBI agents working the case, they'd told me to focus on my ranger duties and let the professionals handle the investigation. You knew what happened to me, Sarah continued, her hospital scrubs stained with blood that looked fresh despite 15 years in the ground. You all knew, but you let them get away with it. You let them perfect their methods, expand their operation, take more of us. She pointed deeper into the forest, toward a trail that hadn't existed on any map I'd studied. And now they have Isabella. She's young, healthy, pre-med with perfect organ compatibility. They've been watching her for months, Tyler. They know her blood type, her tissue markers, her surgical history. She's worth $500,000 on the black market. I tried to key my radio, but instead of the usual chatter from base station, I heard screaming. Men and women crying for help, begging for their lives, calling out names of loved ones who would never see them again. My GPS showed my location as 20 miles east of where I actually stood, somewhere in the middle of Lake Cushman according to the satellite data. Even my compass spun wildly, the needle dancing like it was drunk on magnetic interference. That should have been my cue to head back, call for backup, approach this like any rational man would. But rationality had never been my strong suit when people were counting on me. And besides, I was starting to understand that whatever was happening here was bigger than normal police work, bigger than jurisdiction and protocol and backup units that might never come. As I followed Sarah's spectral form down the impossible trail, more victims began appearing in the shadows between trees. Marcus Rodriguez emerged from behind a cedar, still wearing the hiking clothes he'd died in during his 2003 disappearance. His liver had been harvested so expertly that the medical examiner had spent 3 hours trying to figure out how a bear could remove an organ without damaging surrounding tissue. "They're getting smarter, Tyler," Marcus said, falling into step beside me like we were old friends instead of ranger and victim. "Using better equipment, learning from their mistakes. The early ones, like Sarah and me, we were practice runs. Now they have mobile surgical units, portable anesthesia, organ preservation systems that can keep a kidney viable for 12 hours in transport." Jennifer Walsh appeared next, the young teacher whose heart had been surgically removed in 2007. "They're not just random killers," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They have clients, waiting lists, people with money who need organs and don't ask questions about where they come from. Isabella isn't just another victim. She's a special order, Tyler. Someone requested her specifically." The trail led through terrain that violated every geological survey I'd memorized in 2 decades of ranger work. We were walking through a narrow canyon, cutting through bedrock that shouldn't exist, surrounded by forest that grew in impossible patterns, trees twisted upward in spirals, their branches forming surgical symbols I recognized from Isabella's medical textbooks. The very landscape seemed infected by whatever evil had been operating here. More ghosts joined our procession as we walked deeper into the supernatural wound in the forest. Tommy Blackwater, the Maca teenager who'd vanished in 2009, his organs harvested with such precision it looked like a teaching demonstration. Lisa Park, the Korean exchange student whose corneas and skin had been removed by someone with ophthalmological training. David Morgan, the army medic whose own medical knowledge had probably been used against him when they took his eyes and lungs. Each ghost whispered the same accusations. "You knew, Bradford. You all knew, and you did nothing. We died while you filled out paperwork and followed orders. We screamed for help while you worried about jurisdiction and evidence chains. We bled out on surgical tables while you convinced yourself the official explanations were easier to believe than the truth." They were right, and their collective judgment was tearing me apart from the inside. I had known. We all had known. The FBI agents with their classified files and mysterious reassignments, the local cops who stopped asking questions after their first few cases got buried, the medical examiners who learned to write animal attack on cause of death reports without actually examining the surgical evidence, the hospital administrators who never noticed when large quantities of surgical supplies went missing. The conspiracy wasn't just about covering up crimes. It was about protecting a system that had been operating for decades, maybe longer. Someone with serious power and resources had been using these mountains as a hunting ground, and people like me had been trained to look the other way when the evidence got too uncomfortable. By the time I reached what looked like an old logging camp deep in the canyon, the sun was setting and my guilt was eating me alive. The ghosts of my failures surrounded me now, dozens of victims whose cases I'd let go cold, each one more detailed and horrifying than my memory had preserved. They pressed closer with each step, whispering details I'd tried to forget. How Sarah Chen's kidneys had been removed with surgical precision while she was still alive. How Marcus Rodriguez had been kept conscious during his liver extraction. How Jennifer Walsh had watched them prepare the instruments that would steal her heart. That's when I heard Isabella screaming. The sound cut through the supernatural chaos like a knife, raw and desperate and absolutely real. It came from a concrete building hidden beneath camouflage netting and tarps, its windows barred with steel reinforcement that looked military grade. Through a crack in the foundation, I could see surgical lights blazing and steel tables arranged in a pattern that made my stomach turn. This wasn't just some backwoods operation. It was a full medical facility, complete with monitoring equipment, organ preservation units, and surgical instruments that probably cost more than my annual salary. Isabella was strapped to the center table, conscious and terrified. IV lines running from both arms to bags of clear fluid that I recognized as surgical anesthesia. But she wasn't the only victim. 3 other tables held bodies in various stages of surgical preparation. A young man who looked like a college athlete, an older woman with medical identification still clipped to her hospital scrubs, and a teenage girl who couldn't have been more than 16. The figures in surgical masks weren't just doctors. They were something else entirely. As one of them turned toward my hiding spot, I saw eyes that were completely black, like staring into the void between stars. When he moved, it was with inhuman precision, every gesture calculated and predatory. His hands ended in surgical instruments instead of fingers, scalpels and clamps that grew directly from his bones. I tried to call for backup again, but my radio crackled with voices from deeper in the past. Not just my cases, but every victim this thing had taken over decades of feeding. Sarah Chen pleading for help as they prepped her for surgery. Marcus Rodriguez screaming as they cut him open while he was still awake. Jennifer Walsh crying for her mother as they reached for her heart. The chorus of the dead filled my earpiece, making it impossible to reach the living world. My phone showed no signal despite being in an area that should have had full bars. Even my emergency GPS beacon seemed dead, its red light dim and failing like it was being drained by some external force. The supernatural entity controlling these organ thieves had been feeding off human suffering for decades, growing stronger with each harvest, using the network of traffickers to collect not just organs, but the terror and despair of victims and families. Through the foundation crack, I watched as the lead surgeon approached Isabella with instruments that gleamed in the surgical lights. "Perfect specimens," he said in a voice like grinding bone. "Young, healthy, pre-med training means her organs will be pristine. The clients have been very specific about their requirements." He held up a chart that looked like Isabella's complete medical records, including details that should have been confidential. Type O negative blood, perfect kidney function, no history of disease or drug use. Her heart alone is worth $300,000 to the right buyer. Isabella tried to speak, but the breathing tube made it impossible. Her eyes found mine through the crack, and I saw recognition there. She knew I was her only chance and time was running out. The anesthesia was already taking effect, her struggles getting weaker as the drugs flooded her system. That's when I understood the true horror of what I was facing. This wasn't just organ trafficking. It was supernatural predation on an industrial scale. The entity had been using human accomplices for generations, probably centuries, evolving its methods as medical technology advanced. What had started as ritual sacrifice in pre-Columbian times had become a sophisticated medical operation that harvested both physical organs and spiritual essence, feeding an ancient hunger that grew stronger with each victim. I could have waited for backup that might never come, could have followed protocol and let another family lose their daughter to this nightmare. But Maria Garcia's words echoed in my mind. She's everything to us. She's our light. And suddenly all those ghosts that had been haunting me weren't accusers anymore. They were allies, victims who wanted justice as much as I wanted redemption. The assault on the building should have been suicide. I was one man with a service pistol against a supernatural entity and its human accomplices, in a facility designed for surgical precision and control. But as I kicked down the reinforced door, something extraordinary happened. The ghosts of every victim I'd failed to save surged forward with me, their spectral forms giving me strength I'd never felt before, knowledge I'd never possessed. Sarah Chen guided my aim as I put 3-round center mass into the first surgeon, her nursing training helping me target vital organs with impossible accuracy. Marcus Rodriguez whispered tactical advice as I flanked the second, his military experience from before medical school, showing me how to move through the facility like a trained soldier. Jennifer Walsh showed me the hidden passage where they kept additional victims, her teacher's instinct for finding students who needed help translating to locating the imprisoned and dying. But the entity itself was different. As I reached Isabella's table, it materialized as a writhing mass of shadow and surgical steel, its form constantly shifting between ancient ritual sacrifice and modern medical technology. Obsidian knives became titanium scalpels, stone altars transformed into operating tables, ceremonial bowls morphed into organ preservation units. It was the same hunger that had been feeding in these mountains for millennia, just wearing different masks as human civilization changed around it. "You cannot stop us, Bradford," it hissed in voices that belonged to every surgeon it had corrupted, every medical professional it had turned into a harvester of human flesh. We have been feeding on human suffering since before your civilization existed. We will continue long after you are forgotten. Your species creates us by valuing some lives over others, by creating markets in human flesh, by teaching healers to see bodies as collections of parts rather than whole beings. The worst part was that it was right. Every black market organ sale, every medical system that prioritized wealth over health, every time someone died because they couldn't afford treatment, while others paid millions to extend their lives, all of it fed this ancient hunger. The entity wasn't just exploiting human evil, it was cultivating it, encouraging the conditions that made organ trafficking profitable and morally defensible to those who participated. But it was wrong about one thing. As I cut Isabella's restraints with hands that shook from more than just adrenaline, I felt the love that had driven me into these woods, not just from the Garcia family, but from every family who had trusted me to bring their loved ones home. That love, combined with the righteous fury of all those unsolved victims, created something the entity couldn't understand or consume. For the first time in its ancient existence, it faced not just a human opponent, but the collective will of everyone who refused to let evil win simply because it was profitable or convenient. The ghosts of Sarah Chen, Marcus Rodriguez, Jennifer Walsh, and dozens of others formed a barrier around Isabella's table, their combined spirits creating a protection that surgical steel couldn't penetrate. The battle that followed wasn't physical, it was spiritual, emotional, a war fought in the space between heartbeats. The entity showed me visions of failure, of Isabella dying on that table despite my efforts, of her family grieving like all the others. It projected images of every life I'd failed to save, every case I'd let go cold, every time I'd chosen bureaucratic safety over moral courage. But I had something it didn't expect. The accumulated wisdom of 23 years of bringing people home, guided by the spirits of those I'd failed. Together, we showed the entity something it had never seen. A man who had learned from his mistakes, who carried the weight of past failures not as burden but as motivation to never fail again. We showed it families who loved their children more than life itself, communities that would never stop searching, and the simple human truth that some things are worth dying for. The spiritual warfare reached its climax when Isabella flatlined on the table, her heart stopping as the anesthesia and trauma overwhelmed her young body. In that moment, I had to choose between saving her life through conventional CPR or trusting in something beyond medical training. The ghosts surrounded me, whispering instructions that came from love rather than science, teaching me how to call a soul back from the edge of whatever darkness had been trying to claim it. I placed my hands on Isabella's chest and channeled 23 years of determination, 43 years of loving families who had trusted me with their most precious possessions, and the collective will of every victim who had died in this place. CPR became prayer. Medical technique became spiritual intervention, and for one impossible moment, the boundary between life and death became negotiable. Isabella's heart started beating again, strong and regular, as if she'd never been in danger. The entity's scream of rage shook the concrete building, causing surgical lights to explode and equipment to short-circuit in showers of sparks. When the smoke and dust cleared, the facility was revealed for what it truly was. Not just a harvesting operation, but a supernatural feeding ground that had existed for centuries. The concrete building dissolved into ancient stone covered with pictographs depicting ritual sacrifice and organ harvest dating back to pre-Columbian times. The entity had been using European settlers, then modern criminals, to continue its feeding cycle, evolving its methods, but never changing its hunger. Isabella Garcia survived, though she carries scars both visible and invisible from her ordeal. The organ trafficking network collapsed overnight as its supernatural controller was banished, finally giving closure to dozens of cold cases spanning 2 decades. The families of victims like Sarah Chen, Marcus Rodriguez, and Jennifer Walsh finally learned the truth about what had taken their loved ones. As for me, I learned that some evils are too ancient and too patient to be fought with conventional methods. They require not just courage, but the willingness to confront our own failures and transform guilt into purpose. The ghosts don't haunt me anymore. Instead, they stand guard, ready to help me protect the next family that needs their daughter brought home safely. My name is Tyler Bradford, and after 24 years as a forest ranger, I finally understand that the most dangerous predators in these woods aren't the ones that walk on four legs. They're the ones that feed on human suffering and hide behind the mask of civilization, counting on good people to look the other way when the truth gets too uncomfortable. But some of us don't look away. Some of us remember every victim, carry every failure, and refuse to let evil win, because in the end, that's what separates us from the monsters. We fight not for ourselves, but for the families who trust us to bring their light home from the darkness. My name is Mike Henderson, and I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for exactly 8 months and 12 days when Grace Anderson disappeared. Not that I'm counting or anything, but when you're the rookie and something like this happens on your watch, every damn day feels like a year. The veterans always said the forest would test you eventually. I just never thought it would try to break my mind doing it. October 15th, 2019. The morning Grace vanished started like any other. I was checking trail conditions near the Hoh River when dispatch crackled through my radio. Unit 7, we've got a missing person report. 22-year-old female, Grace Anderson, last seen on the Spruce Nature Trail yesterday evening. My stomach dropped. The Spruce Trail was supposed to be one of our safest routes. Families with kids hiked it daily. How the hell does someone just disappear from there? Grace's family arrived at the ranger station within hours, and seeing them nearly broke me before I even started searching. Her mother, Patricia, kept showing me the same photo over and over. Grace grinning at the camera, arm around some guy I assumed was her boyfriend. She's getting married next month, Patricia kept saying, voice getting smaller each time. She just wanted to clear her head before the wedding. She does this every time she's stressed, goes hiking alone. Her father, Robert, stood silent in the corner, jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Bring our little girl home, son. Please. She's all we got. The boyfriend, David Martinez, looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red and hollow, hands shaking as he pulled out his phone. She texted me at 6:47 p.m. yesterday, he said, showing me the screen. Said the sunset was beautiful and she'd call me when she got back to her car. He swiped to another message. Look what she sent right after. The photo made my breath catch. Grace smiling in front of an enormous Douglas fir. But something was off about the image, like the shadows fell wrong despite the bright evening light. I started the search with Ranger Collins, a 20-year veteran who moved through the forest like he was born in it. Stick close, Henderson, he warned as we headed down the trail. October's when the park gets weird. Lost 3 hikers this month to what the brass calls navigational errors, but I've been here long enough to know better. I wanted to ask what he meant, but Collins had already moved ahead, his weathered face scanning the tree line like he expected something to jump out at us. The Spruce Nature Trail should have taken us 2 hours to search completely. It's a simple 3-mile loop with clear markers every quarter mile. Grace's car was still in the parking area, a red Honda Civic with a Save the Whales bumper sticker and graduate school parking pass from University of Washington. Her purse was locked inside, phone sitting on the dashboard, fully charged. Nobody just walks away from their phone, Collins muttered, circling the vehicle. Especially not a 22-year-old girl. We found her first clue at mile marker 1. A torn piece of flannel caught on a branch about 6 feet off the trail. Collins held it up to the light, frowning. This is fresh, maybe 12 hours old. But look at the height. He was right. The fabric was hanging way too high for someone Grace's size to have snagged it accidentally. She'd have to jump up to catch this branch, and there's no reason to do that on a marked trail. That's when I noticed the footprints. Grace's hiking boots had a distinctive waffle pattern on the soles. Her father had shown me a photo of them. The prints led off the main trail toward a dense grove of old-growth cedar, but they were spaced wrong, like she'd been running or stumbling. Worse, about 50 yards in, they just stopped. No signs of a struggle, no disturbed ground, nothing. It was like she'd just vanished into thin air. Collins was quiet for a long time, studying the spot where the tracks ended. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. Henderson, I'm gonna tell you something and I need you to listen carefully. This park has been here for over a century, but these particular woods are older than that. Way older. Sometimes they take people, and sometimes they give them back changed. Sometimes they don't give them back at all. I thought he was being dramatic until we heard Grace calling for help. The voice came from deeper in the forest, faint, but unmistakably hers. "Help me, please, someone help me." Collins and I looked at each other. We were maybe a quarter mile from where her tracks disappeared, and there was no way she could have gotten that far without leaving more sign. But we had to check. We pushed through undergrowth so thick it blocked out most of the afternoon sun, following her cries as they echoed off the massive tree trunks. We found her sitting by a creek, arms wrapped around her knees, sobbing. She looked up when she heard us crashing through the brush, and relief flooded her face. "Oh, thank God," she gasped. "I've been lost for hours. I thought I was going to die out here." But something was wrong with the picture. Grace was clean. No dirt, no scratches from pushing through thick forest. Her clothes weren't even damp despite sitting next to running water. And her eyes. Christ, her eyes looked ancient, like they'd seen things no 22-year-old should ever witness. Collins grabbed my arm before I could approach her. "That's not Grace Anderson," he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Look at her hands." I did, and my blood went cold. The woman sitting by the creek had the deep calluses and sun damage of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors. But Grace was a graduate student who'd never done manual labor in her life. The thing that looked like Grace smiled at us then, and its teeth were too sharp, too white. "What's wrong?" it asked in Grace's voice. "Aren't you going to help me?" When we didn't move, its expression shifted, becoming hurt and confused. "Please don't leave me here alone. I'm so scared." Collins was already backing away, pulling me with him. "Move, Henderson, now." We turned and ran, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots. Behind us, the Grace thing started screaming. Not calling for help anymore, but shrieking in rage and something else. Something that sounded like hunger. The sound followed us all the way back to the main trail, where it suddenly cut off, leaving us gasping in the afternoon silence. "What the fuck was that?" I panted, hands shaking as I checked my radio. Collins was pale, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool October air. "Something that wants us to think we found her," he said. "Something that's probably got the real Grace somewhere else entirely." He looked back toward the forest, jaw set. "And something that's just getting started with us." We called for backup, but it would be another hour before the search and rescue team arrived. Collins insisted we stay on the main trail and keep moving. "Never stay in one place too long when the forest starts playing tricks," he warned. But as we walked, I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. Trees I swore hadn't been there on our way in. Trail markers that pointed in directions that didn't match our map. And worst of all, we kept passing the same distinctive boulder every 20 minutes, even though we'd been walking in a straight line. That's when the memories started hitting me. At first it was just flashes, images of other missing persons cases I'd studied during ranger training. A family of 4 who'd disappeared near Mount Rainier in 2003, twin sisters who vanished from the Cascades in 2011, an elderly man who went missing from this exact trail system last spring and was never found. But these weren't just academic case studies anymore. I could see their faces clearly, hear their families crying, feel the cold weight of failure settling in my chest. Then it got personal. I was 8 years old again, standing in my backyard in Spokane, watching my little sister Emma climb too high in our apple tree. "Get down from there," I shouted, but she just laughed and climbed higher. The branch broke. She fell 20 feet onto concrete. Spent 3 months in the hospital with a broken back and traumatic brain injury. Mom never said it was my fault, but she never had to. I was supposed to be watching Emma. I was supposed to keep her safe. The guilt hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over on the trail. Collins was suddenly beside me, gripping my shoulder. "Henderson, stay with me, kid. Don't let it in your head." But it was too late. The forest had found my weak spots and was pressing on them like infected wounds. Suddenly Emma was there, standing on the trail ahead of us, but not 8-year-old Emma. This was Emma, as she would have been if I hadn't failed her. 26, healthy, beautiful, with kids of her own. She smiled at me with tears in her eyes. "You let me fall, Mikey. You were supposed to catch me, but you let me fall." "That's not real," Collins was saying, but his voice sounded far away. "Henderson, that's not your sister. Look at me." But I couldn't look away from Emma as she started to change, her face shifting into Grace Anderson's features. "You're going to let me die too, aren't you, Mike? Just like you let Emma get hurt. You're not a real ranger. You're just a scared little boy who can't save anyone." The worst part was that she was right. 8 months on the job and I'd never handled a real emergency. Never saved anyone's life, never proven I deserved the badge. I was 24 years old and still felt like that 8-year-old kid who froze when his sister needed him most. How the hell was I supposed to find Grace Anderson when I couldn't even find my way out of my own guilt? That's when Collins slapped me. Hard. "Snap out of it, rookie. Whatever you're seeing isn't real. The forest is feeding on your guilt, making it stronger. You want to save that girl? Stop wallowing in old mistakes and focus on the present." The Emma Grace thing snarled and began to fade, but not before hissing, "You'll see me again, Mikey. Every time you close your eyes, every time you fail someone else. I'll be waiting." By the time the search and rescue team arrived, Collins and I had managed to make it back to the parking area, but barely. I felt like I'd aged 10 years in the space of an afternoon. The team leader, a grizzled veteran named Rodriguez, took one look at our faces and knew something was seriously wrong. "We need dogs," Collins told him immediately. "And we need them now, before it gets dark. This isn't a normal missing person case." Rodriguez started to ask questions, but Collins cut him off. "Trust me on this, Rudy. Get your best tracking team and stay in radio contact every 5 minutes. Don't let anyone get separated, and if anyone starts seeing things that don't make sense, you get them out of there immediately." The search resumed at dawn. Grace had now been missing for over 36 hours, and despite the mild October weather, hypothermia was becoming a real concern. Worse, a storm system was moving in from the Pacific, promising heavy rain and wind by afternoon. If we didn't find her soon, we might not get another chance. This time, they brought in a K9 unit from Seattle. The German Shepherd bear picked up Grace's scent immediately from clothing her parents provided. But instead of leading us deeper into the forest like the day before, Bear headed in the opposite direction, toward an area of old-growth forest that had been closed to the public for years due to unstable terrain. That section's been off-limits since 2015, Rodriguez explained as we followed Bear's determined pace. Had a series of accidents there. Hikers getting turned around, equipment malfunctions, couple of unexplained injuries. Forest Service figured it was better to just close it down rather than deal with the liability. The deeper we went into the restricted area, the more wrong everything felt. The trees here were massive, some easily over 6 feet in diameter and hundreds of years old. But they grew in patterns that didn't make sense. Perfect circles, strange geometric shapes, like they'd been planted rather than grown naturally. The underbrush was too quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzzing. Even our footsteps seemed muffled. Bear suddenly stopped and began whining, hackles raised. Ahead of us, barely visible through the forest, was a structure that definitely wasn't on any park map. It looked like an old cabin, weathered gray wood and a moss-covered roof, sitting in a clearing that shouldn't exist. But as we got closer, the proportions seemed off. The windows were too tall, the door too narrow, like it had been built for people with different dimensions than normal humans. "What the hell is that doing here?" Rodriguez muttered, checking his GPS. "This location isn't supposed to have any structures. It's been wilderness for over a century." Collins was studying the cabin with the expression of a man who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Some things are older than our maps," he said quietly. "Question is, what's it doing here now?" That's when we heard Grace screaming. The sound was coming from inside the cabin, raw terror and pain that made my stomach clench. Without thinking, I started running toward the sound, but Collins tackled me before I reached the porch steps. "Don't," he hissed. "That's what it wants. You go charging in there, you'll end up just as trapped as she is." But we could hear her sobbing now, begging for help, calling out for her parents. Rodriguez was already on the radio, calling for more backup, but Collins shook his head. Won't do any good. That thing's been playing with us since yesterday. More people just means more victims. So what do you suggest? I demanded. Just leave her in there? Collins was quiet for a long moment, studying the cabin. Finally, he pulled out a small leather pouch from his jacket pocket. My grandmother was Kino, he said, opening the pouch to reveal what looked like herbs and small bones. She taught me some things the Forest Service doesn't include in the training manual. Things about dealing with the old spirits that never left these woods. He began sprinkling the contents of the pouch around the cabin's perimeter, muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. As he worked, the screaming from inside grew louder, more desperate. But now I could hear something else underneath Grace's voice. Something that sounded like laughter, low and cruel. That's not Grace, Collins said when he finished the circle. Hasn't been for a while now. Whatever took her is using her voice to lure us in, probably been doing it since yesterday. The real question is whether she's still alive in there, or if we're already too late. Rodriguez had been quiet during Collins' ritual, but now he stepped forward. Okay, let's say I buy into this supernatural bullshit. What's the plan? We can't just leave without checking if she's really in there. Collins pointed to the cabin's front window. Look carefully at the reflection in the glass. Tell me what you see. I stared at the window, and at first all I could see was the distorted reflection of trees and sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes moving inside. Shadows that didn't correspond to anything casting them. And in the center of the room, barely visible, was what looked like a human figure suspended from the ceiling by threads or ropes, swaying slightly like a grotesque puppet. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez breathed. Is that her? Before Collins could answer, the cabin door swung open. Grace Anderson stepped out onto the porch, but this time she looked exactly right. Dirty, scratched, exhausted, but clearly the same woman from her family photos. She saw us and began crying with relief. Thank God. I've been trapped in there for hours. Something was keeping me prisoner, but it just left. Please get me out of here. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run to her, to wrap her in a blanket and carry her back to safety. She was exactly what I'd been searching for. Scared, hurt, but alive. Her parents were waiting for news. David was going crazy with worry, and here she was, finally found. But Collins grabbed my arm again. Look at her feet, he whispered. Grace was standing on the porch in her hiking boots, the same distinctive waffle-pattern soles we'd been tracking. But she wasn't leaving footprints on the wooden boards. And more disturbing, I could see straight through her to the cabin wall behind. The thing wearing Grace's face must have realized we weren't fooled, because its expression began to change. The relief and fear melted away, replaced by something ancient and hungry. When it smiled, its teeth had doubled in number, sharp and predatory. You're smarter than most, it said in a voice that was Grace's but with harmonics that hurt to hear. But it won't matter. She's still alive, you know. Down in the root cellar, wrapped in spider silk, dreaming the dreams I feed her. You could save her if you're willing to trade places. Don't listen to it, Collins warned, but I was already stepping forward. Because underneath the monster's taunts, I could hear something else, a faint heartbeat, rhythm getting weaker by the hour. Grace Anderson was still alive in there, but she was running out of time. The thing that looked like Grace laughed. The rookie ranger wants to be a hero. How precious. Do you know how many heroes I've collected over the years? How many men walked into my parlor thinking they could save someone? Its form began to shift and change, showing me glimpses of other victims, hikers, campers, even other park rangers who disappeared over the decades. They're all still here, you know, still dreaming, still feeding me their fear and guilt and regret. Would you like to see them? Suddenly, the clearing was full of ghosts, men and women in hiking gear from different eras, all looking at me with hollow, accusing eyes. I recognized some of them from missing person files. The family of 4 from 2003, the twin sisters from 2011, dozens of others stretching back decades. And standing among them, wearing a park ranger uniform that looked like it was from the 1980s, was a man who could have been Collins's younger brother. That's Ranger Morrison. Collins said quietly, his voice thick with old grief. He was my partner for 5 years before he went missing in '92. We found his truck, his radio, his weapon, but never him. Morrison looked at Collins with eyes full of sorrow and mouthed a single word: run. But I couldn't run. Not with Grace still alive in there, not with her parents waiting for news, not with David showing me photos of their wedding invitations. I thought about Emma again, about how I'd frozen when she needed me most. This was my chance to finally save someone, to prove I deserved the badge and the responsibility that came with it. "I'll trade," I said, stepping toward the cabin. "Let Grace go and take me instead." "No!" Collins lunged forward to stop me, but the entity gestured and suddenly he was frozen in place, unable to move. Rodriguez was stuck too, his hand frozen halfway to his radio. The Grace thing smiled wider, showing rows of needle teeth. How noble. How stupid. But I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, young Ranger. You see, I don't just collect bodies, I collect souls. And souls are much more valuable when they're seasoned with guilt and failure and regret. You're too young, too inexperienced. You haven't failed enough people yet. That's when I realized what it was really after. "You want me to fail?" I said. "You want me to watch Grace die knowing I could have saved her? You want to add her to the list of people I couldn't protect?" "Now you're beginning to understand," the entity purred. "Every ranger who comes into my forest carries the weight of everyone they've failed to save. The more failures they accumulate, the more delicious their souls become. Collins here has fed me well over the years. 23 people he couldn't find, couldn't save, couldn't protect. His guilt has been a steady meal for decades." I looked at Collins, frozen but aware, and saw the truth in his eyes. This thing had been torturing him for years, feeding on his failures, growing stronger with every person he couldn't save. No wonder he'd tried to warn me away from the forest. He knew what was waiting out here in the shadows. But as I stood there in that impossible clearing, surrounded by the ghosts of the entity's victims, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was hearing Grace's heartbeat getting weaker, or seeing the pain in Collins' frozen eyes, or remembering how David had looked when he showed me their wedding invitations. Whatever it was, I felt something my ranger training had never prepared me for, a connection to every person I'd sworn to protect. Grace's parents didn't know their daughter was dying in a monster's lair while they waited at the ranger station, clutching photos and praying for good news. David didn't know the woman he loved was suspended in spider silk, living a nightmare beyond imagination. They were trusting me to bring her home, believing in me, even though I'd only been doing this job for 8 months and 12 days. And suddenly, that trust felt like the most powerful thing in the world. "You're wrong," I told the entity, feeling strength flowing through me from somewhere I couldn't identify. "I haven't failed enough people yet because I haven't tried to save enough people yet. But Grace Anderson isn't going to be one of my failures. Her family loves her too much for that." The entity's smile faltered. "Love? You think love matters here? I've been feeding on human suffering for centuries, boy. Love is just another seasoning for the main course of despair." But something was happening to the frozen ghosts around me. As I spoke about Grace's family, about their desperate love and faith in me, the spirits began to look different. Less hollow, less despairing. Morrison stepped forward and placed a spectral hand on my shoulder, and for a moment, I could feel the echo of every person he'd saved during his career, every family he'd reunited, every life he'd protected. "Love doesn't just matter," I said, feeling the connection growing stronger. "Love is what makes us human. It's what makes us worth saving. And it's what's going to get Grace Anderson out of here alive." The entity shrieked in rage, and suddenly we were inside the cabin. The walls were covered in webs, thick as rope and sticky with some kind of viscous fluid. And there, suspended from the ceiling in a cocoon of silk, was the real Grace Anderson. She was unconscious, but I could see her breathing, could hear that precious heartbeat still fighting to continue. The entity had dropped its Grace disguise and revealed its true form, something spider-like but with too many eyes, too many legs, and a mouth full of rotating teeth. "You want to save her so badly?" Try." It gestured, and suddenly the cabin was full of copies of Grace, all screaming for help, all looking equally real and desperate. This was its final trap. Force me to choose wrong, to save a fake, and let the real Grace die, adding another failure to feed on. But as I looked at the dozen Grace Andersons begging for rescue, I closed my eyes and listened instead of looking. Heartbeats. Only one of them had a real heartbeat, getting weaker but still fighting. I opened my eyes and walked straight to the cocoon hanging from the ceiling. The entity roared and charged at me with all its legs and teeth in fury, but something incredible happened. The ghosts of its other victims suddenly solidified, throwing themselves between us. Morrison and the missing hikers and everyone else who'd been trapped here for decades formed a wall between me and the monster. "Cut her down," Morrison shouted. "We'll hold it." I pulled out my knife and started slashing at the webs holding Grace. The silk was incredibly strong, but it was just spider web in the end, and my blade was sharp. She fell into my arms, unconscious but breathing, and as soon as I touched her, the entire illusion began to collapse. The cabin started to dissolve around us, revealing we were actually standing in a natural cave system deep underground. The entity's true form writhed and screamed as its victims finally broke free from their spectral prison, turning on their captor with decades of accumulated rage. Collins and Rodriguez were suddenly free to move again, both rushing toward me as the cave shook with supernatural fury. "Move!" Collins shouted. "The whole place is coming down." We ran through collapsing tunnels, Grace in my arms and her heartbeat getting stronger with every step away from that nightmare. Behind us, I could hear the entity's death shriek as its victims finally got their revenge. We emerged from a hidden cave mouth into normal forest, with normal afternoon sunlight and normal bird songs, and the most beautiful storm clouds I'd ever seen rolling in from the Pacific. Grace woke up as we reached the medical helicopter, confused and frightened but alive. Her first words were, "David." And when she saw his photo on my phone, she started crying with relief. "I thought I was going to die in there," she whispered. "I dreamed terrible things, but there was this voice telling me to hold on, that someone was coming for me." Her reunion with her parents at the hospital was the most beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed. Patricia couldn't stop touching Grace's face as if she couldn't quite believe she was real. Robert just held her and cried, this tough construction worker weeping like a child. David proposed again right there in the emergency room, and when Grace said yes, the whole staff started applauding. But the real surprise came when Collins found me later that night. He looked different, younger somehow, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. 23 people, he said quietly. For 27 years, I've carried the weight of 23 people I couldn't save. But today we saved one. Maybe that doesn't balance the scales, but it's a start. The official report called it a cave-in rescue, explaining Grace's disappearance as a fall through unstable ground into a previously unknown cave system. The psychological trauma was attributed to hypothermia and prolonged darkness. Nobody mentioned spider webs or supernatural entities or ghosts of missing persons. But sometimes the truth and the official version don't have to match. 3 months later, I got an invitation to Grace and David's wedding. They'd postponed it once because of her ordeal, but she was determined to go through with it. "Life's too short to wait for perfect timing," she told me when I called to congratulate them. The invitation included a handwritten note. "Thank you for bringing me home. Love, Grace." I kept that note in my wallet, right next to a photo of my sister Emma. She's 26 now, married with twin boys and still dealing with some effects from her childhood injury. But she's alive, she's happy, and she forgives me for being 8 years old and scared when she needed me. We talk every Sunday, and she always ends our calls the same way. "Love you, Mikey. Stay safe out there." Love. It turned out Colin's grandmother was right about the old spirits in the forest, but she was also right about something else. Some forces are stronger than fear, stronger than guilt, stronger than the darkest things that lurk in the spaces between the trees. Grace Anderson made it home because people loved her enough to never give up hope. I found the strength to save her because I finally understood that love, from family, from friends, from people who trust you to do the right thing, doesn't make you weak. It makes you capable of impossible things. The forest still tests every ranger who works these trails. It always will. But now I know its secrets, and more importantly, I know mine. My name is Mike Henderson. I've been a forest ranger at Olympic National Park for exactly 11 months and 20 days. And I've learned that sometimes the most important thing you can carry into the darkness isn't equipment or training or experience. Sometimes all you need is the knowledge that someone, somewhere, is waiting for you to bring them home. And that's a responsibility I'll never take lightly again. My name is Thomas Bradley, and I've been a forest ranger for exactly 8 months when Rachel Davis disappeared into the Blackwood National Forest, and what I found in those woods changed everything I thought I knew about reality itself. But to understand how deep this horror goes, I need to start with why I became a ranger in the first place, and the sister I lost when I was 12 years old. Sarah Bradley vanished on a Tuesday morning in March 2005, walking to school through a shortcut that took her past the edge of Blackwood Forest. She was 9, wore pigtails that bounced when she laughed, and had this way of humming Disney songs that could make even my grumpy teenage ass smile. The police searched for 3 months, brought in dogs and helicopters and even some FBI profilers, but they never found so much as a hair tie. Mom cried herself to sleep for 2 years straight, and Dad started drinking bourbon for breakfast, and somewhere in the middle of watching my family disintegrate, I swore that if I ever had the chance, I'd make sure no other family went through what we did. That's what brought me to Blackwood National Forest in April 2018, fresh out of ranger training and stupidly optimistic about saving the world one lost hiker at a time. My supervisor, Jake Morrison, a 20-year veteran with scars from bear encounters and eyes that had seen too much, tried to warn me about the forest's reputation during my first week. "This place has swallowed more people than any park in the system," he told me, staring out at the tree line like it might attack. Experienced hikers, trained survival experts, even other rangers. They just vanish, and we never find jack shit except maybe a shoe or a backpack. You be careful out there, rookie, and if something feels wrong, you run. I should have listened to Jake, but when you're 24 and convinced you're the hero of your own story, warnings just sound like challenges. I spent my first 8 months learning every trail, every landmark, every camping spot and water source in my assigned sector. I memorized the topographical maps until I could draw them from memory, studied wildlife patterns and weather systems, and thought I knew everything there was to know about these 50,000 acres of North Carolina wilderness. I was so fucking wrong, it's not even funny. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on October 13th, 2018, and I remember the exact time because I was staring at my coffee maker, wondering why I'd been having nightmares about Sarah every night for the past week. "Mrs. Davis's voice came through the phone like breaking glass, raw with panic and love and terror that I recognized from my own mother's cries years ago. "Please, someone has to help me," she whispered. "My daughter Rachel didn't come home from her hike yesterday. She never stays out overnight, never, and I know something's wrong. I can feel it in my bones." Rachel Davis, 22 years old, marine biology student at UNC, experienced hiker who knew Blackwood's trails better than some of the seasonal rangers. She'd been hiking the Serpents Trail, a 7-mile loop that was considered moderate difficulty, should have taken 4 to 5 hours max. Her mother had expected her home by 3 p.m. When Rachel didn't show by midnight, Mrs. Davis called the police, who told her to wait 24 hours before filing a missing person report. Standard procedure, they said. But I could hear in her voice that she knew 24 hours might be too late. "I'm on my way," I told her, and meant it with every fiber of my being. This was my chance to be the ranger I'd dreamed of becoming, to bring someone's daughter home alive and whole. I grabbed my emergency pack, checked my GPS and radio twice, loaded fresh batteries into my flashlight, and headed out to the Serpents Trail trailhead at dawn, watching the sun paint the forest in shades of gold and amber that should have been beautiful, but somehow looked ominous. The morning mist clung to the trees like ghostly fingers, which wasn't unusual for October in the mountains. But as I started down the familiar trail I'd walked dozens of times during training, something felt fundamentally wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The path looked right. Same width, same surface, same directional markers every quarter mile, but the spacing felt off, like someone had stretched the entire trail by 20% while keeping everything else the same. My GPS showed I was in the right location, but the landscape around me seemed subtly different, as if all the landmarks had been shifted just enough to create a constant sense of disorientation. I found Rachel's first item about an hour in, her bright blue water bottle sitting upright beside what should have been the old lightning-scarred oak tree that every local hiker used as a rest stop, except the tree standing there was a healthy pine, completely unmarked by any lightning strike, and when I looked around in confusion, I spotted the scarred oak about 50 yards away, where yesterday there had been nothing but empty forest floor. I picked up the water bottle, noting that it was still cold and about half full, and tried to radio base, but all I got was static that sounded almost like whispering voices. My iPhone showed no signal despite being in an area that always had full bars, and when I checked the time, the display flickered between 8:23 a.m. and 3:47 p.m. before settling on 8:23 a.m. again. The forest around me felt alive in a way that went beyond normal wilderness sounds. It was watching, breathing, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at it. I took photos of where I'd found the water bottle, noting the GPS coordinates, and continued following the trail, which now seemed to curve left where it should curve right. By 10 a.m. I'd found Rachel's granola bar wrapper, her hair elastic, and one of her hiking socks, each item scattered along paths that my GPS insisted didn't exist according to the official park maps. The trail kept branching in ways I didn't remember, offering choices between paths that all looked legitimate, but felt wrong in different ways. I followed what seemed like the main trail, but it led me to a scenic overlook that provided a view of a valley I'd never seen before. Despite supposedly knowing every vista in this sector, the sun overhead cast shadows that fell in the wrong directions, pointing east when it should have been pointing west, and the shadows themselves seemed to move independently of the trees that cast them. When I tried to retrace my steps back to the trailhead, the single path I'd followed had somehow split into 3 separate routes, each one looking like it could be the way I'd come. My radio crackled with what sounded like Rachel's voice calling, "Help me, please help me." But every time I followed the sound, it led me to empty clearings where the only traces were strange symbols carved into tree trunks. The symbols looked fresh, still weeping sap that was dark red instead of the golden amber you'd expect from pine trees. They were carved deep, as if by someone with inhuman strength, and formed patterns that hurt to look at directly. When I tried to photograph them, my iPhone's camera would only show static, and the GPS coordinates kept changing even though I wasn't moving. I sketched the symbols in my notebook instead, and as I drew, I felt a growing certainty that they weren't random markings but some kind of directional system, breadcrumbs left by whoever had taken Rachel. Around noon, I discovered that the Serpent's Trail had gained several miles of additional length without appearing on any map. Winding through sections of forest that seemed older and wilder than anything I'd seen in the park. Trees grew to impossible heights here, their trunks so wide that 10 people holding hands couldn't encircle them, and their branches formed canopies so thick that the ground remained in perpetual twilight. The air tasted different too, metallic and bitter like blood mixed with copper pennies, and every breath made my lungs burn. I found Rachel's hiking boots beside a stream that my map said ran north to south, but the water was flowing uphill from east to west, defying every law of physics I'd ever learned. When I knelt to examine the boots, the water's surface reflected not the trees above, but a night sky filled with stars arranged in constellations I didn't recognize. My compass spun wildly before pointing in 4 different directions simultaneously, each needle indicating the same twisted oak tree that stood about 100 yards upstream. The oak was ancient beyond measure, its trunk covered in the same strange symbols I'd been finding, but these were older, carved so deep they'd become part of the tree's natural growth. As I approached, I realized the knots in the bark looked disturbingly like human faces, not carved or shaped, but grown naturally into expressions of terror and despair. The tree's roots emerged from the ground in impossible ways, forming loops and spirals that created natural steps leading up to branches that stretched out like beckoning arms. At the base of the oak, I found Rachel's jacket and her backpack, both items arranged neatly as if someone had set up a campsite and then simply walked away. Inside her pack, everything was still there. Her wallet, car keys, emergency supplies, even her cell phone, which showed dozens of missed calls from her mother, but no signal to return them. Her last text message, sent at 2:17 p.m. the previous day, read, "Trail is different than usual but beautiful. Should be home by 4. Love you, Mom." The timestamp bothered me because according to the official trail map, she should have been finished with her hike by 2:17, not just getting to the scenic parts. Either she'd taken a much longer route than planned, or the forest had somehow extended itself around her, just like it was doing to me. I tried calling her number, hoping against hope that she might answer. But instead of ringing or going to voicemail, I heard her voice saying, "Hello, who is this? How did you get this number?" As if she were answering in real time. "Rachel, this is Tom Bradley with Forest Service. Where are you? Your mother is worried sick." "I'm on the trail," she replied, her voice strange and distant. "But I can't find my way back. The path keeps changing, and there are people following me. They wear dark clothes and they don't make any sound when they walk. I'm hiding in some rocks, but I think they know where I am. Rachel, stay calm. I'm coming to get you. Can you describe your surroundings?" But the line went dead, leaving me with nothing but static that gradually resolved into what sounded like chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The temperature around me dropped 20 degrees in the space of a single heartbeat, and I realized I could see my breath forming shapes that looked disturbingly like screaming faces before dissipating into the unnatural twilight. As afternoon became evening, though the sun's position in the sky made no sense for the time my watch claimed, I discovered that the impossible had become commonplace in this section of forest. Streams flowed uphill, paths curved back on themselves in Mobius loops that should have been geometrically impossible, and trees grew with their roots in the air and branches buried deep in the ground, their leaves rustling underground while their root systems swayed in the wind above. I passed the same boulder formation 3 times while walking in a straight line, each time finding different items of Rachel's clothing arranged on the rocks. Her socks, her shirt, her hiking pants, as if someone were slowly undressing her and leaving the clothes as a trail for me to follow. The clothes weren't torn or dirty, didn't show signs of struggle, but they were ice cold to the touch despite the day's warmth. And when I held them up to my nose, they smelled like sulfur and something else. Something that reminded me of the morgue where I'd identified my grandfather's body years ago. The forest's geometry continued to defy explanation as I pressed deeper into what should have been familiar territory, but felt like an alien landscape. I walked uphill for an hour only to find myself at the bottom of a valley I'd never seen before. I followed what looked like a clear path, only to have it end abruptly at the face of a cliff that my topographic maps insisted shouldn't exist. Most disturbing of all, I kept seeing the same landmarks. A distinctive rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear, a dead tree with lightning-split trunk, a small waterfall, but they appeared in different locations each time, as if the forest was playing an elaborate shell game with its own features. My radio periodically crackled to life with voices I almost recognized. Sometimes it was Jake Morrison calling for backup at coordinates that didn't correspond to any real location. Sometimes it was other rangers reporting missing hikers with descriptions that matched people who'd disappeared years ago. Once I swear I heard my own voice saying, "Base, this is Bradley. I found her, but something's wrong. The forest..." Jesus Christ, the forest is alive and it's hungry. As the sun began to set, though its position suggested it should have been mid-afternoon, I climbed what I hoped would be a vantage point to get my bearings, only to find myself looking down into a hidden valley that contained something that shouldn't have existed in any natural landscape. Stone structures that looked like they'd been built by humans, but were older than anything European settlers could have constructed, dotted the valley floor, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the valley stood a massive stone circle, easily 50 feet in diameter, with 13 towering monoliths arranged around a central altar. Even from my position on the ridge, I could see figures moving around the stones, people in dark robes performing some kind of ritual that made the very air shimmer with heat distortion. And in the center of the circle, tied to the altar with ropes that gleamed like silver in the dying light, was Rachel Davis. She was alive. I could see her struggling against her bonds, but something was wrong with her movements. Every few seconds, she would stop fighting and stand perfectly still, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if listening to voices only she could hear. Then she would resume struggling, but each time her struggles grew weaker, more resigned, as if whatever force controlled this place was gradually winning the battle for her mind. The 13 robed figures moved in perfect synchronization around the stone circle, their chanting rising and falling in harmonies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The sound wasn't quite human, too deep in some registers, too high in others, like voices layered with inhuman harmonics. As they chanted, the forest around the valley began to shift and change more rapidly, trees uprooting themselves and walking to new positions, streams changing course mid-flow, entire hills rising and falling like ocean waves. I checked my watch and saw that it was now showing 11:47 p.m., though the last time I'd looked it had been 3:22 p.m. The numbers kept changing as I watched, 11:48, 11:49, then suddenly 6:23 a.m., then back to 11:50 p.m. Time itself had become elastic in this place, subject to the same reality-warping force that was rearranging the landscape. As I studied the ritual from my hiding place, trying to figure out how to rescue Rachel without getting myself killed, I began to notice details that made my blood freeze. The altar she was tied to wasn't made of stone, it was made of bones. Thousands of human bones fused together into a single massive structure. The silver ropes binding her weren't rope at all, but chains made of what looked like human hair braided together, and somehow hardened into metal-like strength. Most horrifying of all, the 13 robed figures weren't all human. Some moved with an unnatural fluidity that suggested joints in places humans didn't have them. Others cast shadows that didn't match their bodies, shadows with too many limbs or heads shaped like animals. And one figure, the one who seemed to be leading the ritual, cast no shadow at all despite the bright moonlight that had suddenly appeared overhead. The leader raised what looked like a curved dagger toward the blood-red moon that hung impossibly large in the sky, and began to speak in a voice that came from multiple directions at once. The sacrifice approaches completion, and the doors between worlds grow thin. Soon we shall have the power to reshape reality itself, to make the forest our domain and the town our hunting ground. The girl's terror has seasoned the ritual well, but we need her willing surrender to complete the binding. As he spoke, Rachel's struggles ceased entirely, and she began to speak in a voice that sounded like hers, but carried harmonics that made my bones vibrate. I see them now. I see what happens to everyone who comes to help me. I see their families crying at empty graves, and I understand that resistance only brings more suffering. Take me willingly, and let this end. No, I shouted, abandoning any pretense of stealth as I scrambled down the hillside toward the stone circle. Rachel, don't listen to them. Whatever they're showing you isn't real. The 13 figures turned toward me in perfect unison, and beneath their hoods, I saw faces that belonged to people who'd gone missing from this forest over the past 30 years. I recognized some of them from the missing person photos that lined the walls of our ranger station. Hikers, campers, even other Forest Service employees. Jake Morrison was there, his face pale and eyes empty, though I'd spoken to him just yesterday and he'd seemed perfectly normal. Welcome, Thomas Bradley. The leader spoke without removing his hood. We've been expecting you. The forest told us you'd come, just like it told us about your sister Sarah all those years ago. Would you like to see her? She's been asking about you. From behind one of the monoliths stepped a figure I recognized even after 13 years of growth and change. Sarah, my little sister, but not as the 9-year-old who disappeared in 2005. This Sarah was aged to what she should be now, 22, the same age as Rachel, but her eyes held the accumulated horror of more than a decade of captivity. She wore the same clothes she'd vanished in, somehow preserved in exactly the same size despite her body having grown to adult proportions. Tommy, she said, and her voice was the same as I remembered, but layered with exhaustion and despair that no 22-year-old should carry. I've been waiting for you to come find me. They said you'd come eventually, said all the rangers come eventually, when someone they care about gets taken. That's how they choose their next servants. They wait for someone who cares enough to walk into their trap. The leader lowered his hood, revealing the face of Mayor Robert Hendricks, a man who'd been leading search parties for missing hikers for over 20 years, a pillar of the community, who'd personally comforted the families of the disappeared. His smile was the same warm, reassuring expression he wore at town meetings and charity events, but his eyes reflected depths of malice that seemed to go on forever. "You see, Thomas, we've been using this forest as our hunting ground for over 50 years. Ever since the old mining company abandoned their operations and left us access to the deep places beneath the mountains. The town thinks we're just a historical society dedicated to preserving local folklore, but we're so much more than that. We're guardians of the old ways, keepers of knowledge that predates your Christ by millennia." As he spoke, the other robed figures began removing their hoods, revealing a who's who of the town's most respected citizens. The librarian who'd helped me research local history, the doctor who'd treated my mother's depression after Sarah disappeared, the high school principal who'd given the graduation speech about never giving up hope, the police chief who'd promised my parents he'd never stop looking for their daughter. Every missing person report that came across my desk, I made sure the searches were thorough but ultimately unsuccessful, the police chief said with obvious pride. Every family that begged for help, I offered comfort while secretly rejoicing in their despair. Fear and grief are powerful forces, Thomas, and we've been harvesting them for decades to power our rituals. Mayor Hendricks gestured toward the bone altar where Rachel lay motionless, her eyes now reflecting the same accumulated horror I'd seen in Sarah's. "Your friend here is special, though. Her family's love for her burns brighter than most, and when we complete tonight's ritual, that love will become a permanent source of energy that will let us expand our hunting ground beyond the forest. We'll be able to reshape the entire town, make reality bend to our will wherever we go." The cult had been sacrificing hikers for over 50 years, I realized, using their deaths and the grief of their families to power spells that let them control the forest's very structure. But the victims weren't actually dying. They were being kept alive in a state of supernatural suspension, experiencing endless psychological torture while their life force slowly drained to feed the cult's power. Behind the stone circle, I could now see what looked like a massive cave entrance carved into the hillside, and from its depths came sounds that made my soul recoil. Screaming, weeping, and pleading that seemed to echo from hundreds of throats. Every person who disappeared in these woods over the past half-century was down there, alive but trapped in a nightmare that had lasted decades. "You have a choice, Thomas Bradley," Mayor Hendricks continued, raising his bone dagger toward the bloated moon. "You can join us willingly, help us harvest the fear and love of your fellow humans, and see your sister again whenever you like. Or you can resist and we'll add you to our collection while using your family's grief to power an even greater working. Either way, you're not leaving these woods." The ritual circle began to glow with sick green light, and the forest around us started spinning like a twisted kaleidoscope. Trees and paths and entire sections of landscape rearranging themselves in a dizzying display of supernatural power. The cultists' chanting reached a crescendo that made my ears bleed, and Rachel began to levitate above the bone altar, her body rigid with supernatural force. But as I watched my sister standing among the monsters who'd stolen her childhood, as I heard Rachel's mother's desperate voice echoing in my memory, something shifted inside me that I'd never felt before. Maybe it was thinking about Mrs. Davis waiting by her phone, or remembering my own mother's endless tears, or just the rookie determination to prove I could save someone when everyone expected me to fail. The love these families had poured into their missing daughters felt like a warm light in my chest, growing brighter and stronger with every heartbeat. I thought about Mrs. Davis calling me her last hope, about my mother never removing Sarah's pictures from the refrigerator, about every family member who'd ever begged a ranger to bring their loved one home. That love wasn't weakness to be harvested. It was power, pure and clean, and strong enough to cut through any darkness. Suddenly I could see through the cult's allusions to the true layout of the forest. The paths weren't really changing. They were showing me what the cult wanted me to see, layering false images over the genuine landscape like a supernatural, augmented reality system. But love cut through their deceptions like a blade through shadow, revealing the straight, simple route from where I stood to where Rachel was bound. I ignored the spinning chaos around me, ignored the cultists' increasingly desperate chanting, ignored the geometrically impossible architecture that tried to confuse my senses. Instead, I walked straight toward Rachel, following not the twisted paths my eyes showed me, but the emotional connection I felt to every family member who'd ever asked me to bring their daughter home. Impossible, Mayor Hendricks snarled, as his geometric illusions failed to confuse me. The forest obeys only us. We are its masters. But I kept walking step by step through trees that weren't there and around obstacles that were only shadows, until I reached Rachel and wrapped my arms around her trembling form. The moment I touched her, she gasped as if surfacing from deep water, and the supernatural force that had been levitating her body suddenly released her. The cultists' chanting turned into screams of rage as their control over the forest began to slip, and the landscape around us started returning to its natural configuration. Trees that had been upside down righted themselves with thunderous crashes. Streams that had been flowing uphill suddenly reversed course, creating flash floods that scattered the stone circle. The blood-red moon faded back to its normal silver color, and stars appeared overhead in their familiar constellations. You think you've won? Mayor Hendricks laughed, but there was desperation in his voice now. You've only seen the beginning of what we can do. This ritual has been 50 years in the making, and one love-struck rookie isn't going to stop it. He raised his dagger toward the sky, and the bone altar began to crack and bleed, revealing the true horror of what lay beneath. The entire stone circle was built over a natural cave system, and from the depths came the sounds of hundreds of voices, not screaming anymore, but singing. Every person who'd been trapped in this supernatural prison was adding their voice to a song of hope and defiance that grew stronger with each passing second. The cultists began to panic as their power source turned against them. The fear and despair they'd been harvesting for decades was transforming into something else: courage, hope, and an unshakable determination to see their families again. The missing hikers, rangers, and townspeople who'd been trapped in the underground nightmare were fighting back with the only weapon they had left: the love that had brought people like me into the forest to search for them. Sarah, I called to my sister, who stood frozen between her captors and her chance at freedom. It's time to come home. Mom and Dad never stopped looking for you. They never gave up hope. For the first time in 13 years, Sarah smiled with genuine joy, instead of the hollow expression she'd worn as one of the cult's servants. I know, she said. I could feel their love even down in the dark places. It kept me sane when nothing else could. She stepped away from the cultists and ran toward me, and as she moved, her clothes transformed from the 13-year-old outfit she'd worn into captivity to modern clothing appropriate for the young woman she'd become. The cult's hold over her was breaking, their control dissolving in the face of family love that had burned steadily for more than a decade. But Mayor Hendricks wasn't finished yet. As his followers began to stumble and collapse, their supernatural vitality draining away without the steady supply of harvested fear, he raised his dagger one final time and spoke words in a language that predated human civilization. The ground beneath the stone circle cracked open, revealing a chasm that seemed to descend into the earth's core, and from its depths rose something that definitely wasn't human. The thing that climbed out of the pit had too many arms, too many eyes, and a mouth filled with teeth like broken glass. It moved with the fluid grace of a predator that had never known fear, and when it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The compact is fulfilled. 5 decades of sacrifice have earned you the right to call upon me, mortals. What would you have me do? Kill them all, Mayor Hendricks gasped, pointing at me, Rachel, and Sarah. Make their death slow and painful, and let their fear feed you for centuries to come. The entity turned its multitude of eyes toward us, and I felt my courage waver for the first time since I'd entered the stone circle. This wasn't just a cult of twisted humans. It was something ancient and inhuman, a force that viewed human suffering as entertainment and human love as a challenge to be overcome. But as the creature took its first step toward us, something extraordinary happened. The singing from the underground caverns grew louder, and I realized that every person trapped in the cult's supernatural prison was adding their voice to a song of defiance. 50 years worth of missing people, all of them refusing to let despair win, all of them believing that someone would eventually come to bring them home. The love that had guided me through the cult's maze began to expand, connecting me not just to Rachel and Sarah, but to every trapped soul in the underground nightmare. I could feel their hope flowing through me like electricity, and with it came a power I'd never imagined possible. The entity's multiple eyes widened in what might have been surprise as I stepped forward to meet its charge. "You want to feed on fear and suffering?" I asked, and my voice carried harmonics I'd never heard before. "Try this instead." I opened my heart to every family who'd ever lost someone in these woods, every parent who'd waited by the phone for news that never came, every sibling who'd refused to believe their loved one was dead. The accumulated love of 50 years of searching, hoping, and never giving up flowed through me and outward, creating a wave of pure emotional energy that struck the entity like a physical blow. The creature staggered backward, its inhuman features contorting in what looked like pain. "What is this?" it shrieked. "What are you doing to me?" "Showing you what humans are really capable of," I replied, taking another step forward. "You've fed on the worst of us for decades, but you've never tasted the best. Love isn't weakness to be harvested. It's the strongest force in the universe, and right now there's 50 years worth of it focused on getting these people home to their families." The entity tried to retreat toward its pit, but the singing from below had become so loud that the very stones were vibrating in harmony. The trapped souls weren't just hoping for rescue anymore. They were actively participating in their own liberation, using the love that connected them to their families as a weapon against their captors. Mayor Hendricks and his surviving cultists tried to flee, but the forest geometry was no longer under their control. The paths they'd used to confuse and trap their victims now worked against them, leading them in circles that grew smaller with each revolution. One by one, they stumbled and fell, their supernatural vitality exhausted by the effort of maintaining their illusions against the tide of love and hope that was reclaiming the forest. The entity made one final attempt to regain control, lunging toward me with claws that could have shredded steel. But I didn't dodge or run. Instead, I reached out and grabbed its nearest appendage, letting all the love I'd absorbed flow directly into its alien consciousness. For a creature that had fed exclusively on negative emotions for millennia, the sudden exposure to pure, concentrated love was like acid in its spiritual veins. "Impossible," it gasped as its form began to dissolve. "Humans are weak, selfish, driven by fear and hatred. This cannot be real. You never understood us at all," I told it as its multiple eyes began to close. "We're not just capable of love, we're made of it. Every parent who searches for a missing child, every ranger who risks his life for a stranger, every person who refuses to give up hope even when hope seems pointless. You thought you were feeding on our weakness, but you were really just making us stronger." The entity's final scream echoed through dimensions as it dissolved completely, and with its destruction, the supernatural bonds holding the missing people began to shatter. The cave system beneath the stone circle erupted like a volcano, but instead of lava, it expelled human souls, dozens of them, then hundreds, rising into the night sky like luminous birds before settling gently back into their bodies. The missing people emerged from the underground chambers blinking in the moonlight, alive and whole but bearing the psychological scars of their extended captivity. Some had been trapped for decades, others for just a few years, but all of them shared the same expression of wondering disbelief that their nightmare was finally over. Sarah ran to me and threw her arms around my neck, and for the first time since I was 12 years old, I hugged my little sister. She was older now, marked by experiences no one should have to endure, but she was alive and free and ready to go home to parents who'd never stopped believing they'd see her again. Rachel stumbled toward me on unsteady legs, and I caught her before she could fall. "Is it over?" she whispered. "Are we really free?" "Yeah," I told her, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "It's over. Let's get you home to your mom." The surviving cultists were rounded up by what seemed like half the state police force, who arrived just as the last of the supernatural effects faded from the forest. Apparently, the emergency beacon on my ranger equipment had been broadcasting our location for hours, though none of my radio calls had gotten through. The official report would blame everything on gas leaks and mass hallucinations, but the important thing was that the missing people were going home. Over the next several weeks, as the survivors underwent medical evaluation and psychological counseling, the full scope of the cult's activities became clear. They'd been operating in the forest since the late 1960s, using a combination of local folklore, imported mysticism, and genuine supernatural knowledge to create their hunting ground. The entity they'd summoned was something that existed between dimensions, feeding on negative human emotions and growing stronger with each sacrifice. But they'd made a fundamental error in their understanding of human nature. They'd assumed that love was just another emotion to be harvested, failing to realize that it was actually the force that connected every human consciousness to something greater than itself. When enough love was focused in one place, the desperate love of families searching for their missing members, it created a power that could overcome almost any supernatural threat. The forest gradually returned to normal over the following months, though it would always carry scars from its time as a supernatural maze. Some trails had to be completely remapped, and there were areas where the vegetation grew in patterns that didn't quite follow natural laws. But the disappearances stopped completely, and families could finally begin the long process of healing. Mrs. Davis hugged me so tight I thought she might break my ribs when I brought Rachel to her front door. "Thank you," she whispered over and over again. "Thank you for bringing my baby home." The joy in her voice was the same pure, clean emotion that had powered my walk through the cult's illusions, and I finally understood why love was considered the strongest force in the universe. My own parents' reunion with Sarah was even more intense. 13 years of grief and hope and never giving up poured out in a single moment of perfect joy, and I realized that everything I'd been through, the terror, the supernatural horror, the brush with ancient evil, had been worth it just to see my mother's face when she held her daughter again. The other families had similar reunions as their missing members were identified and returned. Some relationships had to be rebuilt from scratch, and many of the survivors would need years of therapy to process their experiences. But they were alive and free and surrounded by people who loved them. In the end, that was what mattered most. I stayed on as a forest ranger, though my approach to the job changed considerably after my encounter with the cult. I learned to trust my instincts about supernatural dangers, to recognize when love was being weaponized against the forces of darkness, and to never underestimate the power of human connection. The forest whispers to me sometimes, but now it tells me where to find the lost instead of how to join them. Sometimes I still dream about the faces in those crystalline cocoons, and wonder if similar cults are operating in other remote areas, harvesting fear and despair from families desperate to find their missing loved ones. When I wake from those dreams, I remind myself that for every force of evil in the world, there are dozens of people like Mrs. Davis and my parents. People whose love burns so bright it can light the way home through any darkness. My name is Thomas Bradley, and after 8 months and 3 days as a forest ranger, I learned that some trails can only be navigated by the heart, and that sometimes the most important rescue is the one that teaches you to trust in forces stronger than fear. The geometry of evil might be complex and twisted, but the geometry of love is simple and straight, and as long as I follow that path, I'll never get lost in the woods again. The forest is quiet now, peaceful in a way it hasn't been for decades, but I remain vigilant. Love conquered an ancient evil once, but evil is patient and adaptive, always looking for new ways to prey on human weakness. My job is to make sure that never happens again, to be the ranger who stands between the forces of darkness and the families who trust me to bring their loved ones home. And if another cult ever tries to turn my forest into a supernatural hunting ground, they'll discover that Thomas Bradley learned more than just navigation skills during his first real case. I learned that love multiplies when it's shared, that hope grows stronger when it's tested, and that sometimes the best way to fight monsters is to remind them what makes humans worth protecting in the first place.